We are a week in, and it's already a disaster. Hopefully people prepare because it's going to get a lot worse. The newly inaugurated Biden administration issued a flurry of executive orders, many of them relating to the economy. Everybody in America will be forced to make adjustments in their financial matters by these failed policies. Supposedly Americans voted for Joe Biden, but in actuality they have gotten Bernie Sanders. Almost $1 trillion in new debt. People need to understand this funding is not free. It has to be paid for, and the federal government does not have it, nor does it produce any funding. It gets the funding by levying rates against the income of people and businesses. It's a stranglehold. If that stranglehold is applied long enough and hard enough, it can kill the victim. And where is all that money coming from? The middle class and higher taxes. While millions and millions of Americans can't pay their mortgage. What do you think is going to happen when people can't work and feed their families? Of course, job losses are going to be bad when all the states are told to close for weeks and months to flatten the curve, and when half the states shut down and remain shut. This is what a reset looks like. Just because we were able to kick the can down the road for as many years as we have doesn't mean we can continue to do it with the same degree of success. The can is now so large that it can't be kicked. If you try to kick it, you're just going to break your foot. The lockdowns are working as intended to destroy small businesses and enrich multinational corporations, to make people dependent on the state for their income in order to quell the revolutionary spirit, to alienate the individual from his community and family. This is the propaganda put out by the World Economic Forum on the Great Reset. You're not going to own anything, and you're going to like it. You're going to rent everything and have it delivered to your home by drone. So you're not going to own anything, but the people you rent from will. And you're not renting it from a local mom and pop shop. You're renting it from someone like Jeff Bezos, who is wealthy enough to have a fleet of drones that can deliver packages anywhere. Stimulus checks are also not the right solution. People haven't gotten wealthier by governments passing more money. While debt has risen in the U.S., the government is going to have to rely on inflation to reduce the value of the debt. Real debt has to be liquidated in order to ever get back on our feet again. And it gets liquidated by inflation, and that's what they're working on. The next great idea out of government is not hard to guess. UBI, Universal Basic Income, will just exacerbate poverty. A guaranteed wage can't work because you equate productivity with knowing whether people can get more money. Handing out money now does help people in the USA in the short term. It also harms the poorest people in the world who have to produce the things we buy with those loans. But in the long term, we have to pay it back plus interest, and the poor who we enslaved during a pandemic will have more on those repayments. If we were responsible in the first place, we wouldn't need to milk the poor with our greed today. And we'd never lose our power either. We'll get what's coming soon enough. If $2,000 checks are good, then $20,000 is better. And $100,000 checks would be the best. If we give $1 million to every man, woman, and child, we'll all be millionaires and in the same boat. Exactly where we started. With socialism, one can either pull the cart or get in the cart. The crisis hits when the last guy pulling realizes everyone else is in the cart, and he just stops pulling. The reason QE1, QE2, and QE3 didn't crash the dollar was because so many people believed the Fed would be able to unwind the policy. But nobody is going to buy into it again. Nobody is going to bite on this a second time. Everybody knows at this point that QE is infinite. Everybody knows that the Fed is never going to shrink its balance sheet. The balance sheet is going to grow in perpetuity. It's just that now people are under the delusion that it's okay. They don't realize that the only reason it worked the first time was because the world was convinced that it was temporary and a one-off emergency measure. And of course, all of the new debt Joe Biden wants to take on will be monetized by the Fed. The central bank will print even more money to buy you these bonds because the demand for all these treasuries simply doesn't exist in the open market. If the Fed did the right thing and let the economy reflect a market rate of interest, rates would rise and it would stop the government from taking on bigger debt. In fact, it would force the government to shrink the debt it already has. The government would have to be responsible if the Fed did the right thing and allowed interest rates to rise. But because the Fed doesn't have the guts to do the right thing, because it's doing the reckless and irresponsible thing by keeping rates artificially low, they're now creating a situation where now the government is going to take advantage of what the Fed is doing by using that as an opportunity to go even deeper into debt. There are several problems with this borrow and spend while interest rates are low strategy. In the first place, the U.S. government isn't locking in these low interest rates long term. Most of the debt is being financed via short-term paper. What happens when these interest rates rise and the short-term debt matures, and we have to roll it over into a much higher interest rate environment? You see, Joe Biden completely ignores that massive risk because his debt is not going to be financed with 30-year bonds. If the government tried to finance it with 30-year bonds, 30-year rates would rise sharply. The only way to take advantage of these low rates is to borrow in the short-term market, which means we are exposing the taxpayer to the enormous risk that rates go up. So we're not really taking advantage of these low rates. We're simply exploiting them in the short run, but we're setting ourselves up for a huge cost when these artificially low rates are a thing of the past. Second, the only reason rates are so low right now is because given the massive national debt already on the books and the already enormous budget deficits, the Federal Reserve is forced to artificially suppress interest rates in order to finance the enormous national debt. Now Biden wants to take advantage of the fact that interest rates are so low by making that enormous debt even bigger when rates are only so low because we can't afford the debt that we have. So if we can't afford the debt that we have, what's going to happen when we make that debt much bigger because the Fed is keeping rates so low? See, this is the moral hazard. This is the problem that the Federal Reserve has created by enabling all this debt. The government is further taking advantage of what the Fed has done right. Central banks print money out of thin air and loan it to the American corporate debt slaves. Wall Street knows that, and they know that despite the change in the White House, there is no change at the Federal Reserve. Fed policy is going to be consistent. It is going to remain the same. And I think Joe Biden sent a message to Wall Street of the continuity by nominating Janet Yellen, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, to kind of cement in the minds of the markets, or the participants in the markets, that it is business as usual at the Fed, that they will keep imprinting money. They will keep interest rates artificially low in order to sustain asset bubbles. And that is what the stock market is celebrating. To make money in this rigged market, all you need is access to credit. Leverage to the max after every crash. Sell out before the next crash. This is how speculators or the Wall Street bankers turn fake money into real money. Use that money to leverage out on the next cycle. Works every time in the stock market casino. The problem is the average Joe doesn't have access to credit, and because we are not on the inside, we never know when the next crash or top occurs. But the one thing we can all do, and this is not financial advice, either learn to become a trader and work the markets, or sit on the sidelines and acquire undervalued assets and wait for the tides to reverse. No matter which route you take, Uncle Sam and Joe Biden have only one option out of this mess: more debt and debasement.